Welcome back to Ask Steve Judd. My name is Sue Brain, and in this video, Steve and I are going to be talking about aspects. But before we start, the videos are not aimed at total beginners. However, we both believe that you'll get a lot from these videos, irrespective of where you are on your journey. And all the videos are linked and titled on Steve's website, which is stevejudd.co and astrobabbleproductions.com. So let's get started. Steve, why do you say that you could just read a chart just by focusing on the aspects? What do you mean by that?
When I deal with my students, Sue, I always say to them, look, imagine that the horoscope is a cake and that the planets themselves are the ingredients of the cake. The signs of the zodiac that the planets are in show the way that we behave in ourselves. They show internal behavioral patterns. The houses of the zodiac that the planets are in show the areas of day-to-day life that the outside world experiences us as behaving in. It's the way we're seen to behave. But the aspects between the planets in the horoscope show the dynamics of human behavior, both for positive and for challenging. So that's the actual mix of the cake, if you like. Everything else is just the icing and the packaging. So I could actually take away all the signs of the zodiac and the houses of the zodiac because they're just the frames of reference that everything works in. And just by looking at the aspects, I can show behavioral patterns in a chart. The signs and houses give the areas that those behavioral patterns work in and through.
Okie doke. So what I'm really interested in is particularly when we have things like everybody's got an opposition in their chart or a square or something like that. Because that's where we're tested and sort of pressed to go beyond and learn about ourselves. But do you feel that people get hooked into fear around having difficult aspects, and they're almost like I'll give you an example. I have a friend, and his Venus is opposite his Pluto and Saturn, and it's almost like he's almost like made an excuse not to have productive relationships, if you see what I mean. It's almost like there's something going on there, and I'm curious about that. Does that make sense to you?
It does. It really does. There's a number of different levels of answering to this question, of which the deepest is that one has to ask oneself, are you a creature of destiny, fate, and predetermination, in which case the horoscope will dictate the way you behave? Or are you a creature of free will, choice, and self-determination, in which case the horoscope will aid you in making the best choices in life? The planets impel, they don't compel. And that's one of the oldest dictums in astrology, along with as above, so below, and the microcosm reflects the macrocosm. I'm very much free will orientated. And I don't believe that any aspect pattern is fatalistic and creates a specific behavioral pattern. It is a choice on our part how we work with that energy. Having said that, when I see a chart which is loaded with oppositions and squares with a lot of difficult aspects, then I know that that person's going to have a pretty tough time in the first half of life. However, again, it's the free will thing, because many people with difficult charts will then get ingrained into that pattern, and they will suffer over the course of their life because they can't break free of those patterns. Others will look, well, okay, these are challenges. How do I work with them? How do I deal with them? How can I turn them into gifts? And by struggling, because there's no shortcuts here, by struggling, you can then turn those challenges into gifts and you can become a master. So I see many people I'd like to say the majority of people with really challenging charts, by the time they're into their mid-40s, they're turning it around. And by the time they're into their 50s, they're becoming really not only successful, but happy in themselves.
Yes, they know themselves.
They know themselves. The easy charts, when you get charts with lots and lots of trines and sextiles and very few squares and oppositions, of course, they get the girl, they get the guy, they get the job and the car and the house and the kids and the money, but they don't struggle. So they don't really become happy. They get complacent.
For me, it feels like the more difficult or the challenging aspects of the chart gives life depth. It gives you maturity. You have to go through these difficult or project. I think the other thing is about, you know, when you don't understand your chart and you've got a difficult aspect, especially the opposition, this sense of projecting everything onto somebody else until you understand this is your stuff, not theirs.
Yes. Again, there's two answers to this. At a deep level, when you're projecting this stuff onto other people with an opposition, how can you recognize it in anyone else if you don't already know it within yourself? So it is a projection, you're right. But the French have a lovely term for this. They call it, for an opposition, they call it a fait accompli. You're stuck with it. You cannot change an opposition in your chart. When you've got a square or lots of squares, squares create problems, but they also release energy to turn those problems into gifts. Oppositions you're stuck with. They are two diametrically opposite parts of your character that are pulling apart. If they go full circle, they come around and meet at the bottom, because the opposite of an opposition is a conjunction. But you've got to go to experience both sides of the extremes before you can find the center ground. To quote your friend with the Venus opposite Saturn conjunct Pluto, the obvious answer here is, how can you find value and worth in anyone else until you first of all find it within yourself? The better the relationship with yourself, the better the relationships with other.
Yes. And so there's again the chart. When you understand your chart, you can take this luscious learning and actually begin to work with yourself better. And I think it sort of reduces the fear of my cat's about to make an appearance. This sort of sense, as you say, about, you know, is fate destined or fated? Or is it this sort of sense of free will? And I think the chart enables us to move beyond that belief that everything's set and we're a victim to it, into actually, no, we have choice in life here. How we respond, we have choice.
I believe I believe so. Although I do have to comment that this is a Western astrological approach. The Eastern astrological approach is more enshrined in words like karma, fate, and destiny, and the horoscope is cast in stone. But that is potentially because many people in Eastern cultures have grown up over millennia in an environment of poverty, relative poverty compared to Western society, poverty of materials anyway. So their aspirations are that if they suffer enough this lifetime, then next lifetime they will have an improved life.
And also they're much more to do with the more classical, where they need to get married for them to fit into their culture and their society. So that's what they're looking for.
Yes.
In a lot of situations, and also making money or having a job. It matters.
Yes.
And we have
their interpretation of their view of Westerners, of Western astrology is perhaps that it's a little bit decadent because we're too loose with it. And who's to say which is better or worse? But I am ingrained in the Western astrological tradition, and so that is my forte. So that's what I work with.
Yeah. Steve, I want to talk to you more about these the major aspects, the conjunctions. We've talked a little bit about the oppositions, a little bit about the squares. We haven't mentioned the sextiles yet. How do you interpret sextiles?
There are about 15 or 20 different aspects in a horoscope. I only really use 5, and sometimes I use 7. I don't use the minor aspects unless I have to. This is for students to study. I'm a practitioner. I don't have time to study. The minor aspects I occasionally use are the quintile and in conjunction, and perhaps we'll come to them later. But the other 5, the conjunction, the opposition, the trine, the square, the sextile, and perhaps the quintile as well, because that's number 5. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. Yeah. You have to bring the quintile in as well. They can be broadly split into 2 groups, positive and challenging, with the square in opposition definitely being challenging, the sextile and the trine definitely being harmonious. The conjunction can be a mixture of both. The quintile is a magical thing, which is perhaps we'll deal with in a minute. The sextile and trine, there is a fundamental difference here. They're both harmonious. The trine will link 2 planets in a similar element, water to water, air to air. It creates a harmonious flow of energy where things naturally fall into place, harmonize with each other, and it is an easy expression. However, it is also latent. It is where you have a natural ingrained gift that you're probably not even aware of. You just do it naturally. And it takes conscious effort to change it from latent into potent. Too many trines in a horoscope will make someone lazy. Whereas a sextile is different, 1/6 of a circle. It is what I call a window of opportunity. It is potent. It links 2 planets together in an angle that creates options and opportunities to make things happen. A trine just gives you the talent and the gift, if you like, to be able to go, okay, so I'm good at this, I'll just get on with it. The sextile will go, oh, I could do this if I work at it. And if I work at it, I'll get a good reward. So sextiles are more opportunistic. Trines are natural talents. I prefer the sextiles.
And also they get, the sextiles obviously could get triggered as well. I know the trines can, but obviously I would imagine that that's more potent, the triggering of a sextile.
Yes.
An opportunity coming along. Yeah.
Yes. You see, with a sextile, you will always see the window of opportunity opening up around you. Of course, it is up to you if you take it. If you take it, you will normally thrive. And if you don't take it, you lose nothing, but then you will stay the same. And entropy is not always a good thing. Stasis is not always a good thing. It leads to entropy, which can then lead to decay. So I see the horoscope as an alive, thriving, pulsing, throbbing thing that's actually, it's got its own life force. I can see the pulse of the chart sometimes with the transits.
It's interesting, this sense of, I know people who literally, the word is sort of sitting on their laurels, you know, they're so talented, but they don't do anything with it. And it is that sense of perhaps their chart is just very easy. So rather than push forward.
Yes. Is it? I feel that complacency is an abuse of human privilege.
Okay, so those are those are the more simple, and we've talked about. Talk a little bit more about the conjunctions.
Yes, a conjunction is neither positive nor challenging. It is unique. It is easily the strongest of aspect. And there are basically 2 different types of conjunctions. There are the long-term conjunctions involving the outer planets, and then the short-term conjunctions involving the inner planets. With a long-term conjunction, I'm talking about 2 planets being in the same place for like at least 4 weeks and sometimes a year. And then you have a whole generation of people, a whole sub-generation of people being born with a particular trait or talent. Whereas when there's a short-term conjunction, i.e. when something like the sun or moon or Mercury or Mars passes over another planet, that will only last for a few hours or at the most a few days. So that is much more of a personal thing. It creates a particular power dynamic within the individual. It combines the forces of 2 or more planets into a laser-like sharp projective point of action. It's very much a PowerPoint.
So I want to also, that's really helpful and useful about that. But what about the conjunctions that we're born with?
Yeah, again, that creates points in our horoscope where we're naturally sometimes a little bit too strong. You know, if someone's born with, say, what on the surface, a nice conjunction of Mercury and Jupiter, then on the surface, everyone's going to see them as cheerful and jolly and optimistic with strong philosophies and good belief systems. But once they get to know them too much, they go, oh, they talk too much.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've got a conjunction like, for example, Mars conjunct Saturn or Mars conjunct Pluto, then you're going to have to deal with a lot of issues around potential for anger management and the way you manage your energy and the way you use your energy. Otherwise, your energy will use you, and then you've got problems.
Yeah.
So the conjunction does release a great deal of energy into your life. But again, the way you choose to manifest it and use it is negotiable.
Yeah. Just want to talk to you before we go to the more minor aspects, but this Saturn's got a really bad press, hasn't it? Let's face it. With a lot of people, they're quite frightened of Saturn. But when I just want to look at the sort of Saturn oppositions, this sort of, it's got a sort of a reputation of being very restrictive, of not being able to do things or stopping things happening or limiting. So what would you say to people who have a Saturn opposition, particularly to their personal planets?
I would say you don't know how lucky you are. My students laugh at me because I say Saturn's my friend. When you're young, and by young, I generally mean under 42. Yes, Saturn is seen as the planet of limitation, restriction, boundaries, order being imposed upon you, circumstances outside your control holding you back. And it can be seen as the authoritarian, dictatorial, you will not be able to do this. This will stop, we will stop you. That's how it can manifest. But with many people, they will go, all right. See, my attitude with Saturn is clear. If you play by Saturn's rules, he will help you and he will make you very successful. But his rules are very clear. No shortcuts. You do everything the hard way. 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, establish, consolidate, repeat, repeat, repeat. And you do everything thoroughly and properly, and you put in place clear, solid roots and foundations before you take the next step forward. You build a solid base underneath you, and then you're living within your own boundaries and structures. You are your own authority. Many people with Saturn oppositions, particularly to the personal planets, as they age, will go on to become self-employed, have very successful relationships, and everyone will say about them, okay, I don't like them very much, but I've got a great deal of respect for them, and I know where I stand with them. And these are the people with Saturn oppositions who, as they age, get into their mid-40s, they develop very good relationships, whether it's personal and intimate, professional, family, because people will trust them and know where they stand with them.
And they've been
Saturn has boundaries. It's clear rules.
Yeah, it's taught them. It's that's what I love about Saturn, is this, being an Aquarian, having Saturn naturally. It's taught me how to grow up painfully.
Well, in Greek, before the Romans renamed it, Saturn was Chronos.
Yes, time.
From where we get the word chronometer, timepiece. He's old father time. He is the furthest planet you can see with the naked eye. You can see him quite clearly from the northern hemisphere around dusk at the moment, in an hour after dusk, due south. And so you can't see beyond Saturn in terms of any planets. And Saturn has rings which give the impression of being held in, but actually also make you feel a lot more solid, because although Saturn is a gas giant, it's so far from the sun that, particularly at its poles, that gas freezes into crystalline structures which condense and impact, giving a sense of gravity and density. And this is where we get Saturn's key words from around structure, boundary, and discipline.
Yeah, yeah.
No, he's not to be feared. He is to be respected.
And I think that's what I've learned is in my own life is about actually really being grateful for Saturn to enabling me to grow up, to become an adult, a
Yes.
responsible adult. I'm happy about that. So Steve, we want to just talk about, you said about the quintile and the quincunx.
Yes.
Do you want to just talk about, should we talk about the quintile first?
I love the quintile. It was Kepler who came up with the idea of quintiles, or at least he reinvented them. I'm sure they were in use before. They were eradicated in the 1500s by the, well, basically the Inquisition. Because, of course, if you have 5 quintiles in your horoscope, you have a pentagram or a pentagon. And, of course, that's the sign of the devil. So, you know, the Christian Inquisition would have gone out of their way to suppress that. Kepler saw the resurgence of a quintile. And to me, 1/5 of a circle, and I don't give it a big orb, I only give it 1 or 2 degrees, but it has an element of magic about it. And when I say magic, I do not mean hocus pocus. I do not mean stage magic. I mean magic in terms of charm, of not quite enchantment or glamour, but of charm, of a natural talent to be able to create something out of nothing, to be able to know that you are naturally skilled at something. The thing is, a quintile is latent. You have to activate it. It gives you the ability to come across as to other people as someone who's very good with synchronicity, with what seems to be coincidence. You know, it's just that little bit of magic, and I love it. I think I always look for it. You rarely find them. The average person will, I will find 1 strong quintile in maybe 1 every other chart.
Do you know, I'm going to start looking. I haven't worked with them, Steve. So this is really inspiring me. I'm going to start looking for them now.
Look for them, but only give them a very tight orb, a maximum of 2
Right.
degrees.
And just to see how they play out in the person's chart.
Yeah.
So what about the, I call it the quincunx.
Yes.
How do you work with that?
It's called the quincunx because it is 5 signs, and quin is the Latin for 5. Obviously, it is 5 signs apart. The quincunx on its own, the inconjunction is the Western name for it. It's the same thing. It shows 2 planets that are 5 signs apart in different elements, in different modes that have nothing in common. They are past the point of the square, so they're past the point of a challenge and a difficulty, but they're not yet at the point of the opposition. So it's not quite something that you can't do anything about. You can just wrap your life around it. So to me, an inconjunction is an itch you can't scratch. It's a niggle. It's a frustration. It's an ongoing little niggle that just eats away at you. And if it were any bigger, you go, right, I'm going to sort this out. But it's not. It's always there. And it's not difficult to manage, but it's just always reminding you to check that you're doing things for the right reason, and you've got a clean conscience about what you're doing.
Can you just help for everybody? Can you give me an example of a quincunx, of living with a quincunx, or a client you've had with a quincunx?
Okay, so the immediate one that springs to mind is someone, for example, who's got Venus in Capricorn in conjunct Mars in Gemini. So straight away, you've got the Capricorn-Gemini axis, which they're not comfortable with each other. Because one's all about duty, discipline, hard work, and one's about social interaction, intellect, and engagement. Venus and Mars in conjunct each other, there's going to be the need for Venus in Capricorn to be strict with oneself, dutiful, loyal, hardworking, and structured. Whereas Mars in Gemini is going to be all over the place with its fingers in many different pies. And for Venus in conjunct Mars, there will always be a dichotomy between the need for sensual and sexual stimulus at the mental level with Mars in Gemini versus sexual and sensual stimulus with Venus in Capricorn, which is much more structured, disciplined, and with clear boundaries. So there's going to be a dichotomy between the two sides of oneself here. But it can get a little bit more complicated because occasionally you will find what's called a Judd, two in conjunctions coming from the same planet in different angles. So you've got like a very narrow ship's sail.
That's also known as the finger of God.
It's what is known as the finger of fate.
Finger of fate.
And that is when the point at the top of that Judd, you will deal with those planets. You will deal with that energy. And there's no negotiation. And you will either do it willingly or you will be dragged into it kicking and screaming. You know, you will deal with the lessons involved in that planet, because at the bottom, you've got two planets in conjunct going, right, we're just going to eat away at you. They are sextiling each other. They're fine with each other, but they're both having a go at the one at the top. And that's where you've got to work on yourself.
Yes. And the world, life will provide events and people to make that happen on the outside.
Yes.
Steve, there's one last question I want to ask you about, which I've never felt I got to the bottom of this. Venus conjunct Mars.
Common in the charts of monks and nuns, right? Because they can't deal, or they don't want to deal with the large amount of sensual and sexual energy that this conjunction releases. It generally creates someone who's pretty much conventionally heterosexual. Not always, but most 95% of the time, which is a high ratio. It's surprising how many people with Venus opposite Mars swing both ways or are non-heterosexual. There's a number of famous examples of that. Venus conjunct Mars, it very much depends which sign it's in. If it's in a sign like Taurus, then Venus is obviously going to be running the shop. Whereas if it's in Scorpio or Aries, then Mars is going to be running the shop. There is a need, if you have Venus conjunct Mars, to manage one's more forceful nature, whilst at the same time not allowing the sensual nature to completely swamp the physical desire. It is the blend of, if Venus is what you want, Mars is how you get it. So there's a need for balance here in the way one projects and asserts oneself and is able to receive love as well as give it.
And that's what we're all wanting, isn't it? To receive love and know how to give it with grace.
With grace and with equality. Equality. Yes.
Gosh, it's an endless learning process, this life.
Yes, and just one further point I wanted to make. There are certain specific aspect patterns, such as grand crosses, grand trines, T-squares, all of which have specific meanings, all of which are not that common. But there are the more challenging a chart, the more of a struggle your life will be, but the more successful you can become. So embrace the challenges, take them on, be grateful for those squares and oppositions, even the difficult ones, even the ones that hurt and make you hate yourself when you're young and make you doubt yourself. Because if you stick with it, you'll become a master and more.
I think we're going to do a special video just on how to live with difficult aspects. So I think this is a lovely introduction to that, because some of these aspects are really difficult. So is there anything else you'd just like to say about aspects before we close?
Yes, there is actually. In the evening sky, over the coming months, particularly as we get into late December to early February, you're going to be able to go out, if you have a clear sky, in the hours immediately after sunset, and you'll be able to look to the southwest and see Saturn, and you'll be able to look to the south and see Jupiter, and they will be exactly sextile each other. When you see an eclipse, you are looking at the sun conjunct the moon. When you see a full moon, you are looking at the sun opposite the moon. When you actually go out into the outside world and look at the sky, and you could see where the planets are, and you can see the angular relationship they have with each other, you are seeing astrology in action. And this is what our ancestors have been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. And it is from these observations that we've derived meaning as a form of giving us a relationship with the sky, the cosmos, and the heavens. And this is what inspires us and gives us hope, I believe, for the future. Because if we didn't have the planets and the astrology that goes with us, we'd be living in a much more spiritually sterile environment.
And it reminds us to keep looking up.
Always.
Look up, don't look down, look up.
What was it? Oscar Wilde said something about, at least if you're in the gutter, you can look up and see the stars, or something like that.
Well, that's where we get our awe back, isn't it? You know, AWE. And, you know, that's something that we've forgotten, but it's all there.
I go out at 5 a.m. I look out my window and I look high to the south, and I can see Venus so bright at the moment.
Yeah.
So inspiring.
It's beautiful, isn't it? Steve, thank you. What a great chat. I've learned a lot again, and I love it. I can't get enough of astrology. It's just
there'll be more of these, a lot more of these, I hope.
Okie doke. So we'll see everybody next time.